Hey, I'm Jusko from ProudMoney.com. Which credit card issuers give the highest credit limits? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to rank the major credit card issuers in terms of highest initial credit limits, who might be more inclined to give you a credit line increase, who might be more stingy on their credit limits. Now, it is difficult to generalize sometimes within a particular credit card issuer because you might have one issuer that is very generous on the high end in terms of people with high income and a longer credit history, and they might be very stingy on the other end for people that are newer to credit. So there's going to be some nuance here in terms of how we talk about these credit card companies and how we rank them, and I'll talk about those things as we go along. Now, everybody has a different experience. I'm going partially by my own experience and what I know of the market, but I would love to hear what you think, what your experience has been with these credit card companies as well. Please put those thoughts in that comments section below, but let's get started. All right, let's start at the top. Number one, the most generous when it comes to credit card credit limits is Navy Federal Credit Union, both at the high end, people that have a good amount of credit history, and at the lower end, people that are newer to credit, maybe getting their first credit card, oftentimes are surprised at the credit limits that they do get from Navy Federal going in on those first credit cards. Now, the catch here is that in order to get one of their cards, you have to be a member of Navy Federal, which means you have to have some sort of military tie, whether you're in the military yourself, or you are a family of military, or if you are part of the Department of Defense or family of the Department of Defense. So if you can get into a membership with Navy Federal, then you can hopefully be approved for one of their credit cards, and then you'll probably find out that your credit limit is pretty good. This makes some sense because number one, Navy Federal is a credit union, maybe a little less profit motivated than the big banks out there. And then of course you have the military angle where you have a credit union that is trying to help military customers to sort of get their financial footing. Oftentimes younger people who are in the military may be getting their first credit card, so Navy Federal really wants to work for them, and so their reputation is that they do a pretty good job of it. Number two on the list, American Express, known to be pretty generous with their credit limits. Now, there are a few factors to talk about with American Express. Number one, for most people, American Express is probably not going to be your first credit card. When you go to American Express, you probably have some credit history somewhere else, which means if you apply at American Express and they can see some past credit history and it's okay, that means they're probably going to be more generous when it comes to giving you a credit limit versus some other issuers if you're getting your first credit card somewhere else. So that is part of the equation. Now, if you have a good credit history, they're going to be pretty generous with your credit limits. If they're a little less sure about you, oftentimes you might start out with a smaller limit from American Express, but they're pretty good about credit limit increases. Usually about 6 months into having your credit card, if you've been doing everything good with American Express, they will allow you to ask for a credit limit increase if they don't come to you first. So those are all good things. Now, American Express has the Platinum, Gold, and Green cards, which have no preset spending limit, and some people think that means that there is no credit limit, and there definitely is, especially if you revolve a balance from month to month, which is something you used to not be able to do on those cards with American Express, but now you can. And so there are spending limits on any revolving balances, and even on balances that you pay off every month. Even though they say no preset spending limit, there still is sort of a fuzzy limit where if you start to really put some charges on your card, they might put the hammer down and stop you from using the card anymore. So American Express is generous, but don't totally believe the hype when it comes to those no preset spending limits. Number three on the list is Chase, and for some of the same reasons as American Express, most notably in the fact that Chase prefers to have credit card customers that have already established some credit history somewhere else. Now, some people do start with their first credit card with Chase, but it is a little harder to get in with Chase if you're getting your first credit card than it might be with other issuers. So, in the same way as American Express, if you've got some credit history and you're coming to Chase and you've been doing well, well then Chase has some information on you and they feel better about giving you a higher credit limit than someone that they don't have any information on. So Chase tends to be able to give higher limits because they have that information. But Chase does have customers that come in and don't have any kind of credit history, and Chase will give credit cards out sometimes with limits as low as $500. So this is not an across-the-board thing with Chase. A lot of generosity when it comes to credit limits, but if you are newer to credit and you get in with Chase, you might feel good about getting in, but you might not get a great credit limit, and they're a little stingier on the credit limit increases than American Express and maybe even some of the other companies we'll talk about. Number 4, Wells Fargo. Now, this is a bank that sometimes people love to hate, but within the last couple of years, Wells Fargo has really beefed up their credit card lineup, and in my experience, and in the experience of some other people as well, they are giving higher credit limits than they used to in many instances because they want to bring people into these new cards that they are putting out there on the market. So the more credit history you have, just like with any issuer, the higher your credit limits are going to be, but Wells Fargo has definitely upped their game in this department over the last few years. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's going to get a great credit limit. Some people still complain about Wells Fargo as far as that goes. The Bilt credit card is issued by Wells Fargo, and some people complain that they can't get as high of a credit limit as they would like with that card, but overall, Wells Fargo is still pretty generous. Number 5 is Citi. Not a lot to say about Citi, except that they are sort of middle of the road when it comes to the credit limits that they offer to new customers and the ability to get credit line increases from them. So they're sort of, I don't know, that Goldilocks company in the middle. They're not going to give you too much. They're not going to give you too little. You can feel okay about Citi even if you don't get too excited about the credit limit you get. Number 6 on the list is Capital One, and this is probably the company that is the most difficult to place in these rankings because they're almost like two different credit card companies when it comes to how they treat different customers. On the high end, if you have some credit history, you have a decent income, you've got a good credit score, you can get very high credit limits. I've had 2 different Capital One cards where I got a $30,000 limit right out of the gate. On the other end, however, you could start with a very low credit limit if you don't have much credit history. Now, Capital One oftentimes will give people their first credit card, so that's a very good thing, but oftentimes that means you're going to start with a very low limit, and the biggest complaint that people have after they get their first card with Capital One is that they can't get that credit limit to go up from there. The Capital One is often stingy about increasing that initial credit limit, so some people call this being put in the Capital One bucket, where once you are in, they sort of see you as a certain type of customer. You're not going to get any better credit limit from them, at least on that initial credit card. What's weird about Capital One is you might have a credit card that gets bucketed, and then you say, hey, can you increase my credit limit? And they say, no, not on that card, but if you go for a new card of ours, you'll probably get a higher credit limit than you have on that card, and there's complicated reasons for that. But once you're sort of bucketed with Capital One, it's usually not going to get better, but you can get another credit card from Capital One in the future, where oftentimes your credit limit is going to be much higher than that initial credit limit you got from the first card. So it's a very strange way that Capital One works things. Like I said, almost a tale of 2 credit card companies in one. Number 7 is Discover. Now, Discover is not necessarily known for giving great credit limits right out of the gate after approval, but what they are known for is giving credit limit increases if you make Discover your prime credit card, or at least a credit card that you are using on a fairly regular basis. So Discover likes to see some usage out of their cards before they will increase that credit limit, but then it can go up very quickly. So for someone like me that has a Discover card and I don't use it a whole lot, I think I started out with a $3,600 limit and it's never changed. I haven't asked for it to change, but Discover has not come to me and said, hey, we are going to increase your credit limit like credit cards often will. But for other people, they might start out with a $1,500 credit line. 3-4 years later, they might have a $9,000, $10,000 credit line if they've made that Discover card their number one. So that is kind of the reputation with Discover. Start you small, but they will increase it if they see that you are going to be a good customer to them. Now, Discover, as I make this video, is in a situation where Capital One is acquiring Discover, assuming that the deal is allowed to go through by the government, which I believe it will be. What that means in terms of how Discover will exist in the future is very much up in the air, but for the foreseeable future, I have to imagine they will still sort of operate as their own company, and so all of what I've just said should still ring true. Number 8 is a tie between Bank of America and US Bank. Both of these companies going to be sort of middle of the road when it comes to credit limits. Both of them are very high on sort of larger banking relationships where you're not just going for a credit card, but hopefully getting a checking, savings, investments, all that kind of stuff with them as well. Now, all of these banks want you to have that deeper relationship, but you tend to get more from these companies when you have that relationship. And so they are going to be maybe a little more stingy if you just want a credit card, but if you have that bigger relationship, things get better quickly. US Bank, I think in particular, if you make their cards sort of your main spending, like I just said with Discover, they tend to increase those credit limits and be a little more generous to you. Number 10 on this list is Barclays. Now, Barclays no longer offers branded credit cards in the US, meaning they're not Barclays, MasterCards, or Visas. Instead, they're the issuing bank behind partner cards with JetBlue, with Wyndham. They are now the Gap, Old Navy, Banana Republic cards, and a bunch of others as well. Now, Barclays will give you sort of a middle-of-the-road credit limit oftentimes, but their reputation is sometimes to be a little overly babysitting of your credit limit, meaning they are constantly on the lookout for any reason to decrease your credit limit if they don't like something in your risk profile. So some people will complain that they get a card from them and then all of a sudden that credit limit gets slashed for no reason that they can sort of figure out. So if they don't like something you're doing with their cards that they have issued, or if they see something else in your credit report, they're probably a little quicker than some of the other credit card companies to jump on you and decrease that limit, which obviously is not what we're looking for in this list. Number 11 is Bread Financial and their subsidiary, Comenity Bank. So there are Bread Financial credit cards that are issued directly with that branding, and then Comenity does a lot of behind-the-scenes credit card co-brand partnerships with retailers and other organizations. And that's really the history of Comenity, is to be that co-brand partner, and because a lot of their partners are retailers, those tend to be lower credit limit cards, which is why I have them further down the list. Now that said, I have a one of the AAA Visa cards that is issued by Comenity Bank, and I got a $22,000 credit limit when I applied and was approved for that card. So they obviously are giving out higher limits as well, and I'm sure that's true on some of the other cards that they issue in their own name. So they're a little further down the list here because of that co-brand history, but it looks like Bread Financial is also trying to give some higher limits when it makes sense. Number 12 on the list is Synchrony Bank. Like Comenity Bank, their history is much more as a co-brand partner where they are the issuing bank behind retail store cards and other organizations. So like I said, those credit limits oftentimes going to be lower on that type of card than other credit cards out there, and oftentimes not going to get much higher over time. Synchrony Bank does have one or two cards of their own, but their reputation is not to ever be overly generous when it comes to credit limits, and in fact, sometimes their reputation, like Barclays, like I said before, is sometimes to be a little more of eagle eye, looking at your credit score and your credit history and everything pretty hard to see if they need to decrease your credit limit if they get a little antsy about any of your behavior. Now at number 13, the final credit card issuer that we are going to talk about specifically in this video is Goldman Sachs, and even more specifically, the Apple Card. So a few years ago when I did a similar video to this, Apple Card higher up on the list because Goldman Sachs was really trying hard to get into the credit card game in the US, and they had become this sort of splashy card partner with Apple, and they were giving out pretty high credit limits even to people that didn't have a whole lot of credit history. Well, that has changed. Goldman Sachs has lost a ton of money on the Apple Card. They want out of the credit card industry altogether. It seems like right now, as I make this video, they're essentially doing the bare minimum to meet the requirements of their contract with Apple, but those big credit limits are pretty much out the window. In fact, by the time you're watching this video, who knows, somebody else might be issuing the Apple Card. Goldman wants out so badly. So it used to be you could get some nice limits out of the Apple Card, but if you applied today, probably not so much. Now, obviously, there are plenty of other credit card companies out there. I think these are the 13 that people are maybe most interested in, most likely to have in their wallets, or most likely to be looking at. But there are issuers like PenFed, Pentagon Federal Credit Union, USAA, regional banks like PNC, KeyBank, Truist, TD Bank, FNBO, and there are others that I'm forgetting to mention here as well. But those ones tend to be a little more conservative on their credit limits, especially the regional banks, than the sort of big boys in the credit card game. Some people have told me that PenFed is fairly generous on their credit limits as well, but I feel like I don't have quite enough information to really feel good about saying that in a sort of ranking in this video. Anyway, that is it for this ranking. I would love to hear what your experience has been. And then one final point I want to make is that if getting your credit limit higher is something that is important to you as you go along and your income increases, make sure to tell those credit card companies that your income has increased. They love to know. So if you go into your account and your income is up from where it was before, well, that's going to increase your chances of either getting a credit limit increase when you ask for it, or them just saying, hey, we'd like to increase that credit limit a little bit for you without you even asking. So make sure you always do that if that's something that is important. Questions, comments, love to hear them in that comment section below. Otherwise, I thank you for watching. If you do not have any questions or comments, the next thing you're going to want to do is watch that video.